Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we are going to be talking about what the Eldari community deserves in 11th edition. So I've been giving this a lot of thought over the past month or so, what 11th edition is going to bring, and I've always kind of had some ideas about what 10th edition was lacking, especially for the Eldari, and I want to go ahead and share those with you guys and, kind of talk through some of the changes that I think would be better, not only for the Eldari, but for the Warhammer 40k community as a whole, so that we can, kind of proceed in 11th edition in a really fun and engaged way. Because honestly, the beginning of 10th edition was a little bit insane. And, even though I was still playing games at that time, there were just certain builds that were kind of toxic. And that was true of a majority of the game, right? Like, for example, when I started 10th edition, it was the Wraith Knight spam, right? And then we went from Wraith Knight spam when, Titanic and Towering models got that nerf to their ability to overwatch and, be able to kind of see through all obscuring terrain and stuff like that. We got to a place where there was basically, it was like whack-a-mole, right? In the balance. There was tons of broken stuff in the game. And I think 11th edition being more of a, 10.5, hopefully, will make it so that that doesn't happen again. I think for the most part, they have kind of learned from their mistakes, knock on wood. We'll see. But I think that if the balanced team does most, if not all, of the changes that I suggest, we won't have that many issues in 11th edition. It'll be a fun edition, and Eldari players will actually feel justified in what they're taking on the battlefield, right? There's going to be no, I feel bad because I'm taking X, Y, or Z, or, we won't feel like we're super underpowered like we have in recent weeks. And, honestly, since the last balance data slate. So without further ado, let us go ahead and dive right in. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at how to achieve a better Eldari design philosophy. We're going to be reviewing core stratagems and core abilities that I think need a change in 11th edition. We're going to be looking at Psykers and psychic abilities and how they should work in the new edition. We're going to be talking about new competitive terrain types and how they will interact with the larger player base. Talking about secondary objectives, kind of reworking those a little bit. We're going to be talking about Battleline changes potentially and unit caps, which I think both are things that need to be in 11th edition in some way, shape, or form. And lastly, Wargear points, of course. Okay, so let's talk about that better design philosophy for the Aeldari. So I've played the Aeldari pretty much since their inception. I started playing Warhammer 40k in 2nd edition, late 2nd edition, with Imperial Guard, although I kind of always had my eye on the Eldar because I always liked their aesthetic. I always liked the fact that they were fast. I thought that was a really cool thing, right? So when I did start playing them, it was in 3rd edition, and Eldar have always been about moving fast, being able to deal specialized damage with their aspect warriors in different units, and being able to preserve certain units of theirs with careful positioning and abilities. Usually in the form of some kind of move, shoot, move, although move, shoot, move has always had a downside with the units that it has been, primarily used on, and we'll talk about that. Now, the current codex, I think, really conceptually hits the mark here. The index did not. I think the index was honestly problematic in a lot of ways, and I feel like a lot of Eldar players that started playing in 10th edition got the wrong idea of the faction going into it because they came into a faction that was super durable, had super high damage, and was just a bully on the table. And honestly, at the casual level, it did feel like bullying, I have to admit, right? Certain builds really did feel like that. Obviously, if you played more aspect warriors and if you're trying cool, janky things, it didn't feel like that. It did feel kind of like old Eldar, but if you were running, the Wraith Brick and the Avatar of Cain and, the Skothak Wraith Knight and, all of those different things in combination with each other, kind of felt like you were playing a really durable army. Kind of felt like you were playing like Dark Angels or something with how tough they were, right? So I think the index missed the mark. Now the codex hit the mark beautifully. I think it's a well-designed codex for the most part in its rules, in the detachment and, you know, army rules. I think it's well designed. However, we have seen several nerfs that have killed off its initial design philosophy and left it a little bit anemic. So it's kind of like they gave us a full plate, right? It had the meat, it had the veggies, and it had the carbs. And then what they basically did is they took away the carbs. That was the first thing they did, right? They skimped on the carbs. So now we don't have our mashed potato anymore. And then what they did is they cut the steak in half and they gave us just a tiny bit of steak. And they said, okay, so here you go, Eldari players. And to compensate, we're going to give you some seaweed. And we're going to give you some seaweed on the side to make up for the steak and the potatoes that we took off your plate. That's kind of what they did in the last few data slates, honestly. So, yes, it's playable, right? I mean, obviously, we do have a little bit of, meat on the bone, so to speak. We do have our veggies, we need those to be healthy. So, we can win games, absolutely. We're not going to starve, right? It's not like the entire plate's being taken away. But we do feel a little bit anemic, right? We're finishing that meal and we're not really fully satisfied with it. It's definitely not the risotto, if you know what I mean. So, where does this leave us as a community? Well, it leaves us kind of just holding the bag for a lot of, kind of mistakes that GW has made that they've let slip, that players at the top levels are able to just kind of use and abuse. Things like the double, shoot and then hop back in a wave serpent or falcon thing, right? Warhost could do that twice, and then they could do it in the opponent's turn, right? So there was a lot of that. In Aspect Host, you had kind of something similar, but not as egregious, in my honest opinion, with Skyborn just being able to, come out of a transport, shoot something dead, come back in. Honestly, I didn't see there being a huge problem with being able to do that once, but I can see where people kind of got annoyed where it could be done twice or maybe even 3 times if you were taking a Zerman. So this could be kind of, a little bit insane. So GW took that as a key to get rid of everything basically except a Zerman's, kind of fade back ability, his move shoot move ability. And this really hurt the main design philosophy of the codex because that hurt our third thing that Eldar are supposed to be good at, which is we're super fragile, but we can usually save 1 or maybe even 2 with skilled positioning units per turn that just cannot be retaliated against under normal circumstances, if we play it right? And because we've lost that, we've lost a lot of our staying power in games. We're not able to get to that finish line as much as we used to be able to, or we're like, turn 5, we have all the tools we need to potentially win the game. Not always, but potentially win the game on points. Eldari armies, if they didn't completely obliterate the opponent, were always usually, less points. We'd have less points at the end of the game than our opponents did. That's just kind of how Eldari work in general. Which is fine, because if we outscore our opponent, then, we win the game. Now, if you took this away alone, if you took this design of move, shoot, move, and, unit preservation out of the equation, that would be one thing. But unfortunately, other armies in 40k have started to inherit a lot of the rules that were deemed by the larger 40k community to be uninteractive and overpowered when used by the Eldar. So that is what's really kind of grinding a lot of Eldari players' gears right now is, especially mine, to be honest with you. We got all this stuff taken away. We didn't get any compensation for it. We didn't get a new rule set. We didn't get a rework. We didn't get anything. We didn't get any meaningful point decreases. But yet, on the other hand, other armies have been getting the same thing with tougher units that are also faster. It's salt in the wound, so to speak, right? And we know that that was really the only way we could keep at least one unit, damage dealing unit, alive for more than a single turn, was these kind of moves. So, what would I like to see changed in 11th edition? Well, I would like to see a return to the robust identity of the Eldar as an army that's able to mitigate its innate fragility with effective reactive moves. Now, I specifically say reactive moves for a reason here. I am not talking about purely something that is, you get out of a transport, you shoot something, or maybe you don't even have to shoot anything, and then you just get back in for a CP, right? I could see why people think that's uninteractive, especially if you have something like Ignore Overwatch, which, by the way, I do think is important for Aeldari, and we'll go into why later on in the video. But reactive moves in that, there are triggers of which that are slightly stronger than that of other factions. You'll notice that a lot of other factions have, if you move within 9, I can move 6 inches. If you move within 9, I can move d6. Right? And if that move ends within 3 inches of a transport, I can get back in that transport. You combine that with more durable units like Space Marines and other factions like that they can do that very easily. This kind of feels like the Eldar don't really have a solid identity when it comes to this, and the Eldar were the faction that did this kind of thing. So, how do you fix this? Well, you just make the reactive moves better. Simple, right? Instead of ending a move within 9, if you end a move within 12 of a Aeldari unit, you can go ahead and get back in the transport, right? If I'm within a certain distance of a transport, I can give my unit lone operative. And maybe not even just the 18 lone op, but the 12-inch lone op, right? Be like, okay, well, wave serpents, they project their shield out and they shield the, squad from harm, or they shield them from enemy vision, or whatever it is. You could have these types of reactive stratagems that don't rely on just being invulnerable forever, right? There's ways that your opponent can deal with it, but your opponent actually has to think and use their brain to deal with the stratagem, just like we have to do, right? As Aeldari players, we are problem solvers. We need to figure out ways to get around our opponent's strengths. That's what the Eldar are all about, right? That's why I like the Eldar, because it requires me to think in the game, and it really forces me to be so engaged in it. And that's the best kind of Warhammer 40k game, in my honest opinion, right? So I think if we return the Eldar to that, and maybe not give them just straight up move, shoot, move that doesn't have any triggers, right? That just is like, oh yeah, you could just get a move again after you shoot. If we give them these abilities, these reactive moves, or heck, we could even give a unit the ability to move after they shoot only if they destroy an enemy unit. See, this makes it important for the Aeldari player to plan accordingly, because if they don't plan accordingly, then that unit's not going to be able to move again, right? So you have to really plan out your turn and make sure certain things happen. Now, if dice fail you and you roll, 10 ones, that's Warhammer, and that's, you're shit out of luck, right? Honestly, I never think that anything in Warhammer should be pretty much guaranteed. That's just me, right? If you roll 10 ones, you should fail. That's it. If you roll 5 ones, you should fail, for God's sakes, right? There's certain things in the game that you just, if you roll really, really bad, that's what it is, that's the game. So I think if you gave this to Eldar more, I think they would be a lot more successful, but your opponents would also feel like they could have done something to stop it if they had played better. And I think that's really the key there, right? Is making all of these move, shoot, move abilities based on a trigger that is a little bit harder to accomplish than just, hey, you gotta shoot something, right? No, you gotta kill something, or, your opponent has to move within 12 of you, or, et cetera, et cetera. So I would really like to see a return of that. I would like to see there being, maybe new detachments or reworks of certain things like Skyborn Sanctuary, I think should be reworked. I'm sorry, right? I know people hate it. I don't care. If you don't play Eldar, you don't know, okay? You don't know. And unless you're an Eldar player, you really can't speak to how useless Skyborn Sanctuary is nowadays after the nerfs. So, yeah, I just think make it a reactive move, man. Just have Skyborn, do something along the lines of if an enemy moves within 12 of you, you can hop back in the Wave Serpent, right? You can move 6 inches. Actually, I would say move 6 inches and then move into the transport, something like that, right? The whole eligible to fight thing is ridiculous. You're never going to have an Eldari unit and a transport be in a position that's safe after you are, going to charge something and then, consolidate back. No, it just doesn't work like that, right? Now, I would also like to see a rework of several data sheets to make them more exciting and worth using in the codex, because I honestly think there's a huge divide in the units that are awesome and the units that suck. And I don't just mean suck in the way that they're not efficient, because I don't care about efficiency, don't get me wrong. I want a unit to be fun, man. I want a unit to do something when I put it on the field, have a purpose. It doesn't matter how efficient, it could be a little less efficient than other things, right? Wraithguard and Fire Dragons is a perfect example. Wraithguard with Wraith Cannons are not only less efficient than Fire Dragons, but guess what? I don't really care about the efficiency. Like I said, they're just not fun, okay? They're not fun to use. So I would like to see some changes to some data sheets here. And let's talk about that. What data sheet changes would I like to see? First of all, Wraithguard and Wraithblades. I know Wraith units were good in the index, but guess what? GW, especially the balance teams and, the powers that be, need to forget about the sins of the past. There is no army that should be suffering for sins that no longer have a purpose. They no longer exist, right? Wraithguard and Wraithblades. Let's take a look at what made them OP. What made them OP was, especially in the terms of Wraithguard, was the mix of stratagems and buffs that you could layer upon them. You could take them in squads of 10. They had dev wounds, you had fate dice, you had phantasm, you had all these things that you could just pour into Wraithguard units, and that made them really, really strong. So, guess what? You made the codex, they're crap now. You can do to change the rules a little bit. They're not going to become OP. I think leaving them in squads of 5 is totally fine. I have no problem with that. I actually do not care for Death Stars too much. I think the Storm Guardian Warlock Death Star is the only Death Star I really like playing anyway. I really never liked running the big Wraith Brick too much. I was always a little bit uncomfortable with it because it really didn't feel like Eldar, But I think you need to buff Wraithguard and Wraithblades. Now, how can you buff them? So give them a meaningful ability, especially Wraithguard, right? Give them the pistol rule back. Allow them to shoot into combat again. I think it's so stupid that they gave them fall back and shoot, because in a lot of situations, Wraithguard want to stay on an objective. They don't want to lose ground. And by falling back and shooting, they're losing ground. And they're an objective, a primary objective unit that wants to hold down the fort, and be tough. So I think that's really bad. I think give them the pistol rule so they can fire in close combat. I don't see a problem with that anymore, especially since fate dice are gone and all that. They don't have dev wounds on their weapons as of now, so you can at least give them back that ability if you're going to change their datasheet. Also, let's talk about dev wounds on ranged weapons. Without fate dice, I don't think there's a real issue with this, right? Because it's a squad of 5 and you'll get lucky to get 1 dev wound. It's just a nice little to have, right? Because Wraith weapons should have dev wounds, just like the Wraith cannons or D cannons do, right? D cannons have dev wounds. Okay, well, they have the same technology. Why doesn't a Wraith cannon? It just doesn't make much sense, right? So give them back their dev wounds. Higher toughness or 6-up feel no pain would be nice. Again, Ogrins, guys. Ogrins get feel no pain 6-up. They also get access to 4 wounds apiece or a 4+ invul in addition to a really good combat weapon and potentially ranged weapon. And they're also very cheap. You know, Ogrins are very cheap. Ogrins are cheap, and then Bulgrins are the more expensive ones. But you do get one more model in the squad. And they do have a little bit more synergy with grizzled veterans. So, you know, give them a higher toughness. Wraithguard and Wraithblades probably should be either toughness 7 or have a 6-up feel no pain, something like that. I would really like to see increasing their base ballistic skill and weapon skill to 3+ instead of 4+. I think it was a huge mistake to do this to begin with. Now, I understand the leadership, right? Because if you look at the lore, right? And I know I'm not a huge lore guy, especially when it comes to the game mechanics, but this mechanic is a lore-based mechanic, so I feel like you have to do it justice. Leadership is something that makes sense because, you know, and especially back in the day, you know, Wraithguard and Wraithlords never really hit worse than Aspect Warriors because they are dead Aspect Warriors, right? The reason why they see differently is because they're ghosts, right? They're not part of this world anymore. So they need Psykers to guide them, to guide their psyches, because they're a little freaked out, man. It's like if you wake up in a freaking robot, you know, it's kind of like RoboCop. You know, you're going to be a little freaked out once you find out the truth. But this shouldn't affect their fighting ability. It really should just affect how easy they are to manipulate in Battle Shock, right? The world of the spirits is going crazy and they don't have a psyker nearby to guide them and tell them what to do, so they get kind of locked down in their own minds. Because again, I mean, they're pretty much fearless too if you think about it. You know, they're not going to fear anything because there's nothing left to fear. They are already dead. But at the same time, yeah, they can get confused. So I think the Battle Shock thing makes sense, right? And I think even, you know, if they're not near a Psyker, maybe subtract their OC. Maybe make it OC 0. They don't know how to take orders anymore, right? But making them hit on 4s makes the unit just so unreliable in so many ways. So I think that's horrible. Give them back Ballista skill and weapon skill 3+, and have the Psykers give them an additional ability, like have the Psykers give them that boost to their leadership and OC, but perhaps also give them sustained or lethals or something like that when near Psykers. So that, you know, taking a Psyker doesn't feel like attacks. Instead, it feels like, oh, this feels really good to take a Psyker because it actually buffs my dudes. Instead of like, oh, I have to take a Psyker or else these guys are completely worthless, right? And that's really what Wraithguard and Wraithblades are without Psykers, is completely worthless. The only unit that gets away with it is the D-Scythe, you know, because it's a torrent weapon, which, to be honest, I think they should change as well. I think they should change it back to Blast or something, because the Hemlock Wraithfighter has Blast on its weapons, and it's a heavy D-Scythe. It just doesn't make any sense. They're going way too many different directions with all the Wraith stuff, and it's total crap. So I think they should definitely do that. And then Wraithblades, I like their Fight on Death on 3 ability. That's fine. But again, give them those changes that I mentioned, you know, Ballista skill, weapon skill, and all that, and I think you're golden. Let's talk about Vipers. Vipers are a harassment unit, but they've had a history of being terrible in the game, honestly. Now, I do like Vipers, but I don't like the rules. So their -1 to hit is so useless, right? Like, because usually if you can get line of sight on something, you want to try to kill it. Or you want to try to get it to the point where it's bracketed. And if it's bracketed, it's -1 to hit anyway, right? So honestly, in the times where a Viper is useful, it's just it's too many points for what it does. I mean, even at 75 with like a missile launcher and a bright lance, right? So I think instead of that stupid -1 to hit, make it a real harassment unit. You know, give it a small move, shoot, move type of ability, so they can harass units like they used to be able to do, right? That's what it's supposed to do anyway. So like maybe give it a D6+1 or D3+2 move after it successfully hits a target. And again, you'll notice that I said successfully hits a target. It needs to hit, right? It needs to be able to do its job to be able to move back. right? So make it hit an opponent. Once it hits an opponent, it can move D3+1 or whatever it is, right? It can kind of slip behind cover a little bit. And this Viper is not something that, I mean, it can be spammed a little bit, but because of their new base sizes, because of the size of the model, it's going to be really hard to hide a lot of them. So you may only have like one Viper in your army that's just, popping out, hitting something really quick to like weaken it for your other units, and then like popping back into cover, and then like maybe something else takes out that target, right? It's a harassment unit. It's meant to weaken targets. It's not meant to just utterly destroy them. So with the new Viper kit, I think that's a big win if the Viper gets something like that. Okay, let's talk about Wraith Knights. This is the elephant of the room. Everybody's and their mother and their cousins and their aunts and uncles are afraid of the Wraith Knight. Hide your wife, hide your kids, hide your girl. Okay, whatever. Because Wraith Knights are here. Now, honestly, they suck now. I haven't seen a single person accuse the Wraith Knight of being overpowered. Actually, a lot of people forget it exists nowadays. If you ask anybody, they're like, "Oh, Eldar use Wraith Knights." Like they don't know what the hell it is, right? So I think you got to bring them more in line with other knights. Simply put, right? They are a knight type unit. Bring them more in line with those other knights. They only have 18 wounds. They are toughness 12. They potentially can get -1 damage with their little, shimmer shield or whatever. But then you're losing out on ranged weapons. So they're really not great. Their damage output is awful. It's terrible. Their cost is terrible. You're paying more points for a Wraith Knight than the most expensive of Imperial Knights. And the Imperial Knights do like double the damage output, right? And they're way more durable. Especially since, like I said in the beginning of this video, Titanic and Towering are both balanced now, right? So I think it would be a healthy change if you just either reduce the cost of Wraith Knights considerably, like reduce them to like, I don't know, like 360, 355, or alternatively, you can make them the price that they are, but give them buffs, right? Like make their weapons actually hit hard, make their combat something to be feared, right? And I think that they're in a good place at that point. So yeah, definitely buff Wraith Knights. It's needed. Bring them more in line with Imperial and Chaos Knights. Night Spinners. This is a big one, guys. I think Night Spinner should lose indirect fire because it's something that's holding the Night Spinner back. Either the Night Spinner is totally busted or it sucks, right? Depending on what indirect is doing in that particular edition. Lose indirect, gain a lot more direct fire damage, and become cheaper, right? You could do either or, right? You can give it the dev wounds back if you wanted to, like dev wounds. You can keep its ability, just make it direct fire, increase the amount of output that it does, make it cheaper, and I think it becomes a lot more viable as a unit. I don't think it needs to be indirect fire. It's been indirect fire for a long time. I get it. It's part of its lore or whatever. But I'm also going to talk about changes to indirect fire that I think can make indirect fire more interesting. And if, it doesn't lose indirect fire, then we can talk about, the changes to the rule itself that might make the Night Spinner a more viable pick if it becomes cheaper or gains a little bit more damage. Okay, so next is the Hemlock Wraith Fighter. Change its aura to 18 inches. My god, right? When you come out of reserves, you can't even use its ability, man. So change its aura, right? Make it more impactful to a wider spot on the board. Give it the ability when it comes in from reserve to battle shock a unit it shoots at, right? Or just battle shock a unit when it comes in. Like, that would be awesome. Think about a Hemlock Wraith Fighter screaming onto the battlefield and just like shocks a unit and makes it take a battle shock at -1 because of the aura, right? That would be super cool. Give it +1 ballistic skill because it is being piloted literally by a Spirit Seer, and Spirit Seers have ballistic skill 3+. No clue why a fighter, a Hemlock Wraith Fighter, is ballistic skill 4. That makes no sense. And give it a decent shooting attack. So something like Psychic Scream or something like that, right? Like some sort of Destructor type ability where it's like 18 inches, does some, maybe does dev wounds or something, like not like super powerful, but good, right? Make it a psychic shooting attack. And again, you can make it more expensive. You can make it 165 just like the Crimson Hunter, but make it something that's worth taking. And I also think maybe, change the actual range weapons a little bit. I think 18 inches is perfect though. I think if you keep it at 18 inches, that's great. I mean, I don't think they have enough attacks. I think maybe D3 plus 1 attacks, or maybe D3 plus 2 attacks instead of D6 is better, just because it's more consistent. But yeah, it is what it is. Crimson Hunter. I think, believe it or not, it's actually fine, right? The data sheet itself is fine. It's just a little bit expensive, and I think the main thing keeping it back is the flyer rules really suck. So I'm hoping to see some flyer changes, but I don't think they will change flyers. I really don't. I think you should be able to deploy flyers on the board, by the way. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think you should be able to deploy them on the board. I think they should have permanent stealth, right? Like permanent -1 to hit. Or even just minus, I'll go so far as to say this. They're always at -1. They always, give a debuff to an enemy unit shooting at it, -1 ballistic skill, right? So all enemies shooting at it are -1 ballistic skill. I think that'd be great. But you're limited to 1 flyer in your army. I think that would be ideal. So if you do buff flyers, limit them to 1 per army, and that way people have to make a reasonable choice on whether or not they want that in their list. Spirit Seers, allow them to join units again, I think is a big thing, but also make its abilities usable without having to draw line of sight, right? Like having to draw line of sight to your enemy target and draw line of sight to your friendly unit, and they both have to draw line of sight to each other. That's ridiculous. That is way too many, negatives for something that's super squishy, super squishy, right? The thing dies super easily. It only has like 3 wounds, I think. Yeah, I think Spirit Seers only have 3 wounds. They're really easy to kill. On average, a grenade kills it, like easily. And it just doesn't do a lot for its points. So I think you need to either make them super cheap, make them almost like Warlock cost or less, or I think you need to just give them the ability to use their stuff without having to draw line of sight to enemy units. Right? The Spirit Seer is supposed to be a Spirit Seer. He's guiding things through spirits and everything like that, right? So he's getting into the minds of the Wraith Guard and buffing them through their eyes. So as long as the Wraith Guard can see the target, I have no idea why that would make sense that the Spirit Seer also needs it. So I think the Spirit Seer buff it a little bit. Shadow Seer. Shadow Seer, I don't think much needs to be done here, but I would appreciate a 12-inch lone op and or stealth for the entire unit and not just her. Makes no sense why she has stealth and the unit that she joins doesn't have stealth. Again, no sense at all. 18-inch lone op on a fragile melee unit is very useless most of the time. So make it 12. It's a melee unit. She can only join Quins. They're going to want to get into combat. So 12-inch lone op isn't even that good, but at least it's a tiny bit better than 18 inches. And I think she's perfect at that point. Fire Prisms, I think, should gain their old linked fire rule or have linked fire shots ignore invul saves. Yes, here's another thing I wish happens in 11th edition. They bring back something to ignore invuls, man. Like in 9th edition, every army had like a certain way to ignore invuls, and with Eldar, it was fire prisms, and there was a stratagem that allowed them to ignore invuls and just burst right through invul saves. Please, for the love of God, bring back a way to ignore invul saves. I'm tired of 4+ invul saves all over the place. If your entire army has a 4-up invul save and a 2-up armor, like, you better be Custodes. You better be Custodes. There's just way too many factions that have that now. And it's not just Custodians, that's the problem. It's like almost every army you come across, it's either a 4-up invul pretty much army-wide, or like a 2+ armor save army-wide, or some sort of other feel no pain crap. Like, it's just a ton of durability upon durability. And it gets old when you have limited ways to actually interact with those types of units, like get through those durability blocks. I think what 9th edition did better than 10th is that 9th edition had ways to ignore stuff like Feel No Pain and, invul saves, right? And like, I know it made the game more lethal, but let's be honest, let's be honest here, they've given a lot more durability to a lot more units in 10th edition, and I think we need to bring some, not straight up lethality back. Like, I'm not talking about Hail of Doom status or anything, but like bring back some like utility stuff that allows you to do stuff like this, right? So maybe linked fire shots ignore animals. So that means every fire prism after the first, if you're doing linked fire, those shots are less shots, but they do ignore invulns because they're being magnified by the prism cannon. So this would be a really interesting tech, and I think it'd be really, really cool as well. Or you could just bring back the old linked fire rule. Either one, it doesn't matter. But make fire prisms feel good again as a unit. You know, and I think in general you should bring back something that is invul ignoring in almost every army, right? Like it should be a not like a stratagem, but like a certain unit in everybody's army that can ignore invuls of some type. I think would be interesting. Warlocks and Warlock Conclaves. Let's talk about that real quick. They just need to have better melee. Same with Farseers and Eldrad. Their melee is so bad, man. And it's comically bad because it's like a singing spear is a guardsman, guys. It's worse than actually a sergeant. A guardsman sergeant. I know it has damage 3, but against a vast majority of the units out there, just not doing anything. Give it some AP, give all of the, witch weapons anti-infantry, anti-vehicle, anti-monster 2-up. Now, why do I say that? Because back in the day, that's what they did, man. Witchblades always wounded on a 2. That was the historical thing about Witchblades. So I don't care if they have 80 attacks. Don't give them 80 attacks, obviously. Just have them have their 2 attacks, but give them infantry. I would say infantry, vehicle, and monster 2-up. Leave the damage the same. The singing spears don't have to have AP, they have a throwing attack, right? But give them some sort of damage boost, man, because it just feels so bad to throw those things. It's just so embarrassing how bad they are. So make them a little bit better. I don't care if you have to increase warlocks by 5 points, 10 points, right? Whatever. It would actually probably be 5 points a model, right? Realistically, for a weapon that's much better like that, and better in melee too. Make them a little bit better, man, because they're terrible. I would also like to see a extra wound on the warlock characters, not the ones that are part of the conclaves, obviously, but the character warlocks need to have an extra wound, man. It's also embarrassing that they have 2 wounds. Okay, Dire Avengers. Dire Avengers are a problem aspect warrior unit, which is rare because a lot of our aspect warriors are great. So Dire Avengers really just need more damage against targets that they're going to be typically firing at. So better AP on crits to wound would be nice, in addition to what they have. Or simply sustained hits without any restrictions. I think that would make them a lot better at killing light infantry. The problem now with Dire Avengers is they suck even against light infantry. Like, I've had a unit of Dire Avengers shoot at Termagants and, kill 4. Like, come on. It just doesn't feel good, man. Dire Avengers for 75 points, for the points you pay for them, or 70 points. I think it's 75, actually. But, for the points you pay, they should be able to kill a small unit of Termagants or Hormagaunts. Pretty close to dead, right? Like 8 or 9 kills, maybe 10 if, you're a little tiny bit lucky or you use some sort of stratagem, right? So better AP on crits to wound would be nice, in addition to what they already have when they get, sustained within half. Or if you just want to give them pure sustained hits, that would also be good. I would also accept something like, just better AP in general. I think, having AP -2 against units on objectives on all of your attacks, not just your, ranged weapons, but in close combat too, I think would be really interesting. And, Dire Avengers need to embody the unit, the aspect warrior unit that is fierce on the attack and stalwart on the defense. They really do need to have that. So I think the fact that they don't have that kind of sucks. I would maybe like to also see, now I'll address something in a second that I don't think they should get, but Dire Avengers being able to hit harder against units on objectives. I know that Guardian Battle Host does it, but I think every Dire Avenger unit should get it. Hit harder against units on objectives or when they're on an objective. they hit harder or something like that is really nice and would be really cool. Now, some of you are going to suggest in the comments, give Dire Avengers all power weapons. I do not think you should do this, okay? For one, we already have units that can take power weapons. So giving Dire Avengers power weapons is just going to make them really expensive for no purpose. But I think you can easily give them something like AP -1 on their combat attacks against units on objectives, which will represent Dire Avengers being able to throw their shurikens in combat. Remember that in the lore, and again, I'm not a huge lore guy, but in the lore, Dire Avengers can kill without their armor. They throw freaking shurikens, dude. They throw freaking shurikens in the eye, dude. They're walking through Kamara, dude, and a Coblite tries to like mess with them, and he just gets a shuriken right in the fucking throat. Right? I mean, Dire Avengers are badass, so I think that's something that we can definitely, look forward to. And who knows? Maybe we get new Dire Avenger models in 11th too. And obviously, I think the Dire Avenger Exarch's melee weapons should be better. I think they definitely should be better. Now, as for the other data sheets in the codex, I think there are a lot of other minor tweaks that I would make here and there with units, but I feel like these units are the most, they're the worst offenders basically of having terrible data sheets, and I think they just need to be fixed basically. If you guys can think of any other data sheets that suck, let me know. But I think anything that I didn't mention here, either I just forgot about it completely, or it's actually decent, right? Like, I actually think it's like certain support weapons are actually decent against certain matchups, so I'm not like mad at them. Like, I'm not mad at the Shadow Weaver for being good against orcs and Imperial Guard blobs and stuff like that, because that's kind of what it's designed for. It's not designed against Marines. So anyway, so those are the datasheet changes I would make. Let's talk about the core stratagems and core abilities. So, indirect fire. Let's talk about that. I think the biggest problem with 10th edition was how they handled indirect fire. So, indirect fire needs to have at least one other friendly unit that can draw a line of sight to the target to be used. I truly believe that if you don't have a quote unquote spotter unit so that your indirect fire unit can like hone in on the target, you shouldn't be able to use it as an ability. So, what does this mean? Well, it basically means indirect fire weapons can only shoot at units that have, that other units in your army can draw line of sight to, if that makes sense. So, for example, you have a unit in the backfield that's behind terrain, and your opponent does not have line of sight to it with any of their units. I don't think you should be able to target with indirect because you don't know it's there, right? We can assume that, armies are constantly communicating in the 41st millennium. And, if another unit sees a unit behind some terrain, they can say, hey, look, a quick, coordinate, all it takes on a Voxcaster is, coordinates, blah, 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 blah. And they, the indirect fire can target them at that point, right? Because they don't know they're there otherwise, right? So that's what I think should happen to indirect fire, and basically just remove the maximum hit on a 4+, like get rid of that completely, but keep the -1 to hit and benefit from cover debuffs, because obviously you're firing at something out of line of sight. They're gonna get cover because they're probably behind cover, let's be real, and they're going to be a little bit harder to hit. But again, you should be able to use better ballistic skill to your advantage. So, armies like Space Marines, as much as I don't like Space Marines, they are very elite. So their indirect fire should be able to hit a little bit better than Imperial Guard indirect fire or Votan indirect fire, right? Aeldari indirect fire, the little that we have, should be able to hit a little bit better than, Gene Stealer indirect fire or whatever. Gene Stealer Colts, So I think that needs to happen with indirect. I think anything else that happens indirect, I think would be a sham. I think if they got rid of it completely, that would also be a major problem for me because aesthetically and, lore-wise and all that stuff, it would suck. It would erase some of the character from a lot of the units in the game. So I do think this change is needed. but I also think you need to remove the maximum hit on a 4 plus BS that they added in to make it, balanced. And also, that means you can also reduce the cost of a lot of indirect fire stuff. Like, the Night Spinner is 190 points, for God's sakes, right? That's terrible. A lot of indirect fire units pay a steep premium for having indirect fire, so being able to kind of reduce the cost of some of that stuff, I think would be good. And it gives your opponent like actual strategies to use. Like, I want to get, my units in your deployment zone so I can use indirect fire turn one, right? Like, that could be a strategy and that could be interesting. Okay, Overwatch. This is maybe the most controversial thing, right? But I don't think Overwatch is that healthy for the game. I think it became way too popular, way too good. Everyone was overwatching, and usually in my games, like, people overwatch like every turn. It's ridiculous, man. I mean, Overwatch is such a popular stratagem. I think they needed to nerf it a little bit. So I think it cannot be used on a unit that made a shooting attack in its last shooting phase. Simple as that. To me, it doesn't make sense that you can move up a unit of flamers, shoot all your shots, and then a moment later, I mean, these battles are supposed to happen in a matter of minutes. A moment later, you can shoot again for nothing, for a CP, basically. Right? And a lot of armies can do it for free. So I think that's stupid, right? I think if you just made shooting attacks in your last shooting phase, you should not be able to overwatch with that unit. So an eligible unit would be a unit that did not make shooting attacks in its last shooting phase. Simple as that. Or you could make it 2 CP. Now, I personally like the former and not the latter here because I think it makes it a little more strategic, on the units that you're going to position to Overwatch. It's like, oh, I don't want my opponent to have a unit here. Oh, I'm going to position them there. I'm going to make sure they don't shoot anything because they're behind terrain anyway, so who cares? That way they can Overwatch. And I think this makes a lot of sense. If you make it 2 CP, I think it just becomes something that you rarely ever use, and it's not as strategic. It's more just like, okay, yeah, I have this super OP Overwatch unit. I'm going to use it anyway, even for 2 CP, So I think the previous is a little bit better. Now, I would also add a core stratagem called Psychic Hood. Now, what Psychic Hood would do, this would be something every army that has a Psyker unit can use, allows a Psyker unit within 24 of an enemy unit in the command phase, so you have to do it at the start of the command phase, or in the command phase, end of command phase, whatever, that has a psychic ability to roll a leadership test. And actually, now that I think about it a little more, it should be at the end of the command phase after you've taken battle shock and all that, right? So you roll a leadership test. If the test is passed, that psychic ability cannot be used until the end of the turn, can only be used once per turn. So you target an enemy unit. You say, hey, my Psyker unit's targeting your Psyker unit. You have a psychic ability in the squad. Whatever that psychic ability is, you shut it off for the turn. And I mean, you can also, until the end of the turn may actually be kind of crappy, but maybe, until the start of your next, command phase, essentially, right? So I think that would be really cool. I think, obviously I'd have to work on the wording for this to make it like really good, but being able to just cancel a psychic ability would be really awesome. And it kind of brings us back to that, the old days where we had like psyker battles where like psychers could like literally get into a war against each other, like in their minds. So I think that's really cool. Okay, let's talk about Feel No Pain. This is a big elephant in the room, especially now with Catan and stuff. I don't think Feel No Pain should work against psychic abilities or attacks unless the target unit has the psychic keyword. Now, obviously, there are certain things and abilities in the game that give you Feel No Pain against psychic attacks, so I think those should remain, right? Like, if a unit specifically says, oh, you get a Feel No Pain against these attacks, right, that are psychic, I think you should still get that Feel No Pain against specifically that, but I don't think you should get it, like, regular Feel No Pain should not be able to work against psychic abilities, man. Like, think about it for a second. You're getting blasted from the mind, bro. Your mind is getting blasted, man. your soul is getting eaten away. A lot of these psychic abilities don't even target your body; they just target your mind and soul and shit. So I don't think you should get a feel no pain against that. It doesn't really make much sense. So I don't think feel no pain should work against psychic abilities or attacks unless the target also has the psychic keyword, because at that point, we're talking about, defense against psychic abilities, right? And there are certain abilities that give you that feel no pain against psychic stuff. So I think you should still get that. Okay, let's move on to Psykers and psychic abilities. This is what people have been asking for. We need a psychic phase back. I think that having a full psychic phase is not the point. I think just having more interesting psychic powers, units, and abilities is the point here. So we don't need a special phase for it, okay? But what we should have is Psyker units should all get a special feel no pain against psychic attacks. That's just base, right? Should all get a bonus against, a special feel no pain against psychic attacks. And it could be something small, guys. It could be like 6 up. Like any unit that has a Psyker in it gets a 6 up feel no pain against psychic attacks because of an innate psychic defense. And then certain units, if they're a little bit more psychically defensive, they can have bonuses to that. Psychic attacks also across the board should feel a little bit more powerful and should be actual abilities rather than simply another ranged weapon. So this is another thing, like a lot of the abilities like Mind War and stuff, they're literally just ranged attacks, and that sucks, right? I would rather it be some sort of ability on the data sheet so that you can actually use it as that and not just another ranged weapon. That kind of sucks, right? So make them a little bit more powerful. Again, this is to compensate for the weaknesses of psychic weapons, which is there are units in the game that have extra durability against psychic weapons. So make them more powerful, right? I mean, an attack of the mind or a soul shouldn't just be like, oh, D6 strength 4, AP -1. I mean, that's just silly. Come on, right? It should be really powerful. Each ability also is should state what phase it is used in. So, like what we discussed earlier, it doesn't have to be its own phase, and what it needs to be used. And I think it would be really cool if some required a leadership test or others required a different type of cost. Like maybe the unit takes mortal wounds, like, chaos sorcerers. Instead of taking a leadership test, your unit just suffers one mortal wound. You just suck the soul, part of the soul from one of your, fellow chaos space marines or whatever, and you're able to like use your psychic ability for that. Or after resolving the ability, the unit is battle shocked, perhaps. So like this could be like, this would work really good flavor wise for Imperial Guard, Primaris Psykers, man. Because a Primaris Psyker scares the living hell out of the normal guardsman, out of the regular frontline guardsman, right? He is scared shitless of psychers. If he's joined by a psyker because he's forced to, because the higher ups make that unit, kind of escort the psyker around. Like if the psyker uses an ability, like instead of taking a leadership test, just have the unit be battle shocked, man. You know, something like that I think would be really cool and really flavorful. So that would be interesting, right? And if you fail the leadership test, maybe you could have it like, maybe that could be a battle shock or something like that. I don't know. Maybe that would make it a little bit like too intensive. But if you fail it on double ones, or not double ones, sorry, if you fail it on double ones, right, or something crazy like that, like, yeah, you're battle shocked. Like, not only do you fail the leadership test, but you suffer perils and you're battle shocked. You suffer a mortal wound or whatever. So I think psychers and psychic abilities need to be enhanced at some point. And I think they could do all these things and it would all be really cool and flavorful, but it would also serve a purpose in that it would make psychers a lot more important to the game, which they really don't feel like at the moment. They really feel kind of meh. They don't feel like psychers. Okay, let's talk about some new competitive terrain types that I would personally like to see. I think all terrain types in the game should gain the rules for obscuring just like Ruined Footprints do. And of course, in competitive play formats, these terrain types should have outlines where their feature ends, right? So they should have. I know some people don't like it. And I usually don't even play with footprints, to be honest with you. I just play with the, regular terrain when I'm just playing with my friends. But I think for competitive play, this is needed, right? So I think every terrain piece should have a little outline. GW should go through and talk about each different type of terrain and how much of a footprint it has, right? And we can leave it to them to have tournament packs with preset terrain layouts for competitive play. But it's going to have more than just ruins. you know I like ruins, don't get me wrong, man. I find nothing wrong with ruins, but when everything is ruins for the entire edition and nothing is anything else, it gets kind of stale. So to compensate for the power that runes give in competitive play, I think just like runes, again, make obscuring terrain a rule for every single terrain piece, but also give other terrain unique rules as well. So woods, for example, can make units without certain abilities like infiltrate and scouts -1 to hit when fighting inside of them or shooting into them. So if a unit is inside of a wood and your unit shoots at them, they're at -1 to hit. If they fight them in combat, they're at -1 to hit. And I think the only way to ignore things like that, maybe if you have a rule called ignores cover, you could ignore this -1. Or if you're able to, have scout or infiltrate on your data sheet, then you could ignore the -1 to hit in combat. So I think that would be really interesting. And there are ways to get around it. It's not just super OP, right? So you could have a couple of woods on the battlefield, and like this would be a really good place for your skirmishers to fight it out and stuff. Because if other units try to fight in those bits of terrain, they'll do it less effectively because they have a hard time fighting in wooded terrain or whatever. Charging through rubble or barricades could give you -1 to charge move. So if you're charging over rubble or barricades, you're at -1 to charge, right? I think that's a super flavorful ability, and it actually makes it cool to put rubble on the field, right? Like put a piece of rubble in the middle of the battlefield. That'd be freaking awesome, dude. So like if you want to charge in the middle of the board for whatever reason, like you're at -1 to charge because I'm defending a piece of rubble or I'm defending a barricade. So I think that'd be really cool. And obviously, there can be more to this. Like, there could be more rules for more different terrain types. But these are the most common types I think that will be included just because they're the things I see the most. And I mean, we probably see these kinds of terrain the most. Like, woods is really cool. Like, but there could be different stuff for different things, right? So, like, these are the competitive ones I can think about, but there should be more. I mean, and of course, GW could probably come up with more as well. I think this would be really cool. Really cool concept. Okay, let's dive into secondary objectives. What I think should be done with these. Well, believe it or not, I think honestly, 10th edition has been the best edition for secondary objectives. I know, hot take here. I think the ninth edition objectives for secondaries sucked ass. I think they were horrible. I had no fun with them. They were boring. A lot of factions, and they were super overpowered for some factions, like Necrons. Oh, don't even get me started. Necrons basically maxed their secondary score in like 2 turns back in ninth edition, whereas the Aeldari were like struggling to max secondaries for the entire game. It was super difficult. So I think secondaries are done in a very good way in 10th edition. I would like to see more of them though in the deck. So I would like to see like up to 30 choices. That way every game seems a little bit different. It's kind of seeming a little bit samey after a while. Like if you play enough, the objectives are like, oh, okay, engage and storm. And you just learn all the combinations and it gets boring. So I think you should have more variety with a greater variety of conditions, right? And I think you should increase the potential points on objectives that require the unit to survive until your next turn. So as of now, the main reason why sabotage, for example, sucks as a secondary objective is because it's only worth 3 points. It's garbage, right? Like it's only worth 3 points unless you can get into the enemy deployment zone, which is so rare. So unless you draw it in the last turns and your opponent literally has nothing left, you're probably not going to score that for 5, right? You're probably, or 6 or whatever it is, right? It's funny, I forgot how much it's worth on the max because I've never scored the max. I mean, that's a problem, right? So make it worth more. Make sabotage just worth 5, right? Just make it worth a flat 5, and you could do it on any terrain outside your deployment zone, right? Boom, done. Also, I think there should be a slight change to the New Order stratagem. So I think the first time you use New Order, it's free, right? I think that's really important because a lot of the objectives, especially if you add more objectives into the deck, right? You're going to have a greater chance of getting objectives that you literally can't score. And it's impossible to balance this, right? Like because you can shuffle things back in the deck, but it comes to a point where it's like, okay, like am I just literally shuffling everything in turn 1 and once it's all shuffled I get the perfect secondaries? Like that's what it kind of feels like sometimes. So, I think to kind of mitigate that, using more objectives in the deck, but also the first time you use the new order stratagem, make it free. But each subsequent time you use it, so over the course of the game, it costs 1 CP more. So the second time, it costs 2 or 1. The third time, it costs 2. The fourth time, it costs 3. Like it keeps going up. And the reason I think this is a decent idea, and I'm not saying I'm right on this, but I think it's a decent idea because a lot of armies can just get the perfect secondaries every single turn. Like, as an Eldari player, that's kind of what we rely on right now, but it is kind of like wild when I can just say, okay, new order, new order, new order every single turn and get secondaries that I can max out every single time. And I'm like scoring 40 on secondaries and like I'm scoring 30 on primaries or 35 on primaries or whatever. And I'm getting really good scores consistently in my games because of secondary. And even when I draw really crappy secondaries, right? So I think New Order needs to be changed a little bit, right? I think it's really too easy in the early game to draw into really bad secondaries that you just cannot score. And it's too easy to also, as the game progresses, get the perfect secondaries that you need every time because New Order can be used every single turn for 1 CP. Now, alternatively, we could do it like this, right? The New Order CP cost in round 1 is free. In rounds 2 to 3, it costs 1 CP, and in rounds 4 to 5, it costs 2. So that makes it a little bit of a, more of an investment in the later game if you really want that perfect secondary score. I think something along these lines is needed. Now, actually, I kind of think alternatively, when we do the round 1, rounds 2 to 3, and rounds 4 to 5, costing different amounts of CP here for New Order, I like this a little bit better competitively speaking, right? Because I think it adds a lot of strategy to the game that wasn't present before in the later turns. So I think that could be very interesting. Having to save CP in the later rounds for a potential new order is something the players should be thinking about when trying to max their secondary points. Okay. Now this topic I'm really excited to talk about because Battleline is useless in 10th edition. It is useless. I think Battleline changes and unit caps need to happen. So here are the Battleline changes first, and then I'll go into the unit caps. Every army, I think, needs to include at least one Battleline unit. Basically, right? You need a character in your army, but I also think you need a Battleline unit just to make it feel a little bit more realistic, right? And like obviously some armies have units that count as Battleline. Like I don't think this would be a problem for basically anybody because most armies already take at least one Battleline unit, but some armies don't, and it just feels like, like what are you doing? You know what I mean? Like Imperial Knight players who don't take any like small little baby knights. It's annoying, right? Take some Battleline, take some variety in your army. So I think every army has to have a Battleline unit, but here's the thing, Battleline units become better. So you're kind of incentivized to take even more Battleline units because every single Battleline unit is going to get this ability. They are all eligible to start to perform an action in a turn in which they advanced or fell back. There we go, right? So Battleline units can advance and do an action. They can fall back and do an action. I think, and to be honest, I stole this from the new Space Marine detachment for Battleline units. But I think if you give this to every army in the game for their Battleline, I think you fix a lot of the issues with people not wanting to take Battleline because people will want to take a couple units of Battleline in their army for objectives. I think that's really big. So, boom. Battleline units all have the following ability. Now, as for unit caps, this is a big one, and I think it's a big problem in 10th edition. Epic heroes, especially those that have the monster vehicle keyword, they are being spammed like no other. And Eldar are guilty of it too. You know, I have to be unbiased here. Eldar are guilty of it. I think epic heroes shouldn't be like every single battle that I play shouldn't be the Ranadandra. Okay, like I shouldn't be running all the Phoenix Lords, right? They're good, but I should have to make choices about which Phoenix Lords I take or which epic hero monsters I take. And I think that goes for Necrons and that goes for a lot of factions like Space Marines. It goes for everybody. So I think epic heroes that are non-vehicle or monster are capped to 2 per 1,000 points. You cannot have more than 2 epic heroes per 1k. At 2k, you can have 4 epic heroes. However, this is going to be different when it comes to epic heroes with the monster vehicle keyword. I think they should be capped to 1 per 1,000 points. So basically it would be like this. And by the way, these are not intersecting with each other. So if I wanted to take an Eldar army at 2k, I could take up to 4 Phoenix Lords or 4 epic heroes, and I could take the Avatar of Cain, right, as well. So I think that's a reasonable thing. I mean, I know there's more than 4 Phoenix Lords, but I don't think you should be able to take all of them or some crap, right? I know some people will, complain about that, but this is for the health of the game, So I think some sacrifices are needed. Also, let's think about things like Catan, right? Like people are able to take literally like 4 or 5 Catan if they wanted to. This would cap them out at 2 Catan. Or if they want to take like a Silent King in a Catan, they have to do that, right? Like they can't take everything. They can't take like 4 or 5 Catan or Silent King and 3 Catan. It's just ridiculous, They're going to have to, choose something a little bit. They're going to have to make some smarter decisions about army composition and stuff like that. Now, I will say this. For the detachments that are specifically designed for things like Catan and for, I think you can up the cap a little bit in their detachment rules and just say something like, epic heroes with a monster and vehicle keyword in this detachment are capped to 3 per 1,000, or no, 2 per 1,000 points instead of 1 per 1,000 points. So you could have, up to 4 Catan in your, pantheon of woe or whatever it's called. I can't remember what it's called, but the new Catan detachment, right? You can have up to 4 of them in your 2K list instead of 2 of them, right? Which makes sense. It just, again, it doesn't allow you to spam so much of them to where they're like, this isn't even fun to play against. It's not even fun to watch competitively. Like, it's just bad. So I think unit caps need to return in some way, and I think the best way to do it is with epic heroes and epic heroes with the monster and vehicle keyword, and just have them separated, because I don't think all epic heroes are created equal. Don't get me wrong. There's obviously a lot of epic heroes that are just meh. I mean, take a look at Eldar, for example. We have a lot of just meh epic heroes, but it prevents you from just spamming epic heroes, which is what a lot of armies out there just do nowadays. But what I like about the system that I've laid out here is that it still gives you the ability to take epic heroes. It's just you can't take all of them, right? You can't take more than 4, so you have to be a little bit cautious about what you take. Okay, so lastly, let's talk about Wargear points, and then we'll kind of wrap up the video. So, this is going to be controversial once again, but I don't actually give a damn about Wargear points. And this is why, and I'll tell you why, because I've been a player for many, many editions, and Wargear points were always something I complained about because I didn't understand where they were getting the numbers, and the numbers didn't make any sense to me as to why they costed what they costed, okay? And this is clear in my mind because of one thing alone. Every single edition, there have been clearly superior loadouts, and most of those loadouts have revolved around killing Space Marines. There has never been an edition where anybody ever took any weapons that were not effective against heavy infantry or vehicles. They just haven't done it. Nobody was taking grenade launchers, man. Nobody was taking flamers. They just weren't, unless they had no other options. They were not taking those weapons. Okay? So, we've always played in a Space Marine dominated world. And let me give you a perfect example in 5th edition of it. Let's talk about Imperial Guard for a second. Imperial Guard veteran squads. That's an old blast from the past. But veteran squads used to have the choice of taking 3 special weapons per unit and a heavy weapon. So the special weapons were as follows: flamers at 5 points, grenade launchers at 5 points, plasma guns at 15, sniper rifles at 5, melta-guns at 10. Guess what everybody took, guys? Did they take A, the flamers because they were cheaper, B, the grenade launchers because they were cheaper, or C, the plasma guns because they did more damage to Marines, or D, the sniper rifles because they looked cooler? Guess what they took, guys? They took plasma guns. No one took anything else. Plasma guns were basically the competitive weapon choice for the entirety of 5th edition for Imperial Guard veteran squads. Why? They're 15 points a model. Why would you pay that many points? Well, because it was the only weapon that was actually capable of killing Space Marines. So the arbitrary extra 30 points that you spent over the other weapons was almost always worth it if you knew how to play the faction. And honestly, just do the math, right? For 3 flamers, you pay 15 points. For 3 plasma guns, you pay 45 points. There's a 30-point difference. If you're able to fire the plasma guns at least one time and kill 1 Space Marine, you've basically made up the cost of a plasma gun. And usually plasma guns, if you could, fire them over the course of a couple times, if you're hiding in a vehicle or something, you could rack up way more damage than you ever would with flamers or grenade launchers or anything like that, right? So if you have the option to take the Space Marine killer weapon, you're gonna take the Space Marine killer weapon. It's why people take, power fists over power weapons usually, even though power weapons have more attacks and they, sometimes hit a little bit better. Power fists just brutalize Marines. They're damage 2. They're strength 8, right? Sniper rifles, veterans don't really get those options to take a bunch of sniper rifles anymore. But sniper rifles were always the cool, rule of cool kind of weapon, and they were never good, ever in that edition. Maybe if you rolled a lot of 6s all the time. Melta-guns, unfortunately, back then, they were just too short of a range, so they just rarely were able to work as intended. I mean, maybe you took a squad with melta-guns, but you had to choose special doctrines for that unit to make melta-guns good. So there were some options there, but it's like, nowadays, what do people take? They take plasma and melta. Guys, nothing has changed, man. Like, and this is one of the things that frustrates me about people who argue for Wargear points all the time. It's like, nothing would have changed. I remember all the additions. I remember what everybody took. They never took any of the stuff that you guys are advocating for. Like, I would love to put flamers on my Imperial Guard squads. No, you wouldn't, man. You would not like to put flamers on your Imperial Guard squads because it's anti-synergy, right? They have a lot of abilities that do sustained and lethal hits, so you get none of that. And also, it's not good against Marines or anything tough. So you would never use flamers, even if flamers were less points, man. So I'm just tired of the argument that that would balance the game. Now, what I do think, though, okay, is Wargear would make a lot of sense for narrative matches and campaigns where your army is going to grow in power over time, and it'd be a really cool way to add story and character to your army. And a cool way to also give them more options when it comes to certain stories or lore about your own army. So for example, if you have an Imperial Guard regiment that doesn't have access to plasma weaponry because it's a backwater or it comes from a backwards world that's really tech deprived or something, right? That could be a really cool narrative thing. And maybe in your narrative play, you get another additional bonus for not taking any powerful weapons. Maybe you get, extra movement, or maybe you get a bonus with flamers and, something like that. But again, this is all for narrative play, man. This isn't going to be for, your normal competitive Warhammer 40K. This is going to be for crusades or campaigns or something like that. And you could definitely have, actual events that focus on narrative. I think that'd be really awesome. But in competitive 40k, Wargear points are not a good idea because they would do nothing to change the balance of the game. They would not balance things. Okay? They wouldn't. They never have. So why would they now, right? They simply wouldn't, right? And I also think the other problem with putting Wargear points in is it kind of would be annoying to rip off the weapons that are not good. So, like, for example, Storm Guardians have a couple flamers in the squad, right? And if they made flamers 10 points apiece, do you really think anybody would take flamers anymore? So you have two flamers in the unit. Flamers suck, so you wouldn't take them unless they were free. So you just have to rip them off or just count them as not having flamers. I mean, that sucks, right? You have to buy new models perhaps if you wanted to play super competitively. I personally would just proxy things myself because I don't give a damn. I would just say, oh, they're just weapons. They don't have flamers, no big deal. And nothing would change for me. But for a lot of people, think about how much overdrive that OCD would have, right? It's like people who bought battle suits and then they changed all the loadouts of the battle suits. That pissed me off when that happened for Tau. Like, that was upsetting. So could you imagine that game wide on everything? How crappy that would be for everybody. So I really don't like that. Pure and simple, right? Now I do agree that there should be some different options for units, but I don't think they should be in Wargear points. I think they should be in the Wargear that you can take as options. I think squad should have options of Wargear and upgrades. So like I totally advocate for the return of Exarch powers. I totally advocate for the return of unit specializations, like, guard specializations. Maybe like infantry squads, you can have up to 2 or 3 squads in your army that can take a veteran ability, right? That would be super cool. Think about like enhancements, but for infantry units in your list. That would be awesome. If they do that for competitive play, I think there's a way to balance that. But I don't think Wargear points would do shit. So I don't like Wargear points. Make them for narrative play and campaigns and stuff where your army's like total, it's upgrading as you grow bigger and stuff. But yeah, just don't have it in that. And I think, lastly, to kind of leave this off on this note, GW really does need to put good effort, real effort into 2 different game modes for 40k. One being the competitive game mode, which is what most people will play in a pickup game, and then the narrative game mode with, kind of more, long-term things and like, things you could play with a group of friends or in a communal setting, when you're not just doing a random pickup game here and there. So GW also needs to put effort into both, right? So like they need to balance Crusades, in a way. And not like balance it. No. I'm not talking about balance it like competitive play, by the way. Don't get me wrong on that. I'm talking about like making sure the rules actually work as intended. Like erratas basically is what I'm saying. Like, oh, what happens if I give this unit this upgrade? And it doesn't really seem like it's compatible in the rules, but it says I can take it. Clarification on some of the stuff GW should provide for the player. But, as far as like balancing it, no, I don't think you should balance that. But you should just make sure that there's FAQs and erratas based on it just so people know what they're doing with certain upgrades. Like, oh, can I do this and this and this with this special rule? And then GW could say yes or no to that, depending on what it is. Okay, guys, that is going to be it for today's video. I know that was a long one, but thank you for, kind of hanging in there with me. 11th edition's around the corner. A lot of people are just dragging 10th edition at this point because there's been a couple of balanced data slates that have had horrible, just awful reception by the community. And as an Aeldari player myself, I think it's a sad state of affairs, man. It really is. And I expect more from the balance team, but I really think that there wasn't a lot of effort put into it. And if anything, there was a lot of Eldar bias. I think there's a lot of Eldar bias, a lot of Necron bias, in the opposite direction. And even though there has been Ultramarines bias in the last balanced data slate, in this current balanced data slate, I think they finally did some things that were helpful and, you know, brought them down a peg. But I definitely think Necrons is just overpowered. It's going to remain overpowered for the entire rest of the edition. So I know personally that I will be trying my best to figure out ways to beat Necrons. And if I don't find effective means to beat Necrons, I don't have to play against Necrons. That's the beauty of the end of the edition. It's only like a couple more months, right? It's only like 3 months. Like, I don't give a damn. I'll just literally just not play against Necron players. I'll be like, oh, you play against Necrons? Oh, let me see your army. Oh, you're running 5 Catan. Oh, okay, sorry, we're not gonna play, right? Like, if they're running something cool, then I'll be like, oh hell yeah, like I'll play you. But if you're running like Nightbringer, Deceiver, like all the Catan, like the Catan Pantheon, and you're running them in like Awakened Dynasty or something, oh please, bitch, please, I'm not gonna play that. I don't have time for that shit. All right, so thanks for joining in and listening to my rants and my wish list of 11th edition. If you guys want to join the Patreon to, kind of join our Discord and stuff like that, by the way, if you join on a Patreon free trial, the Discord is totally free. I will say that we're coming close to completing the Eldar Knight fan decks. I haven't forgotten about that. I've been working on that. All the rules are complete. So if you want to try it out for yourself, come join the Discord and I'll, kind of link you. I have the, full rules linked in the Discord. And it's been fun. I've played a lot of games with it myself. Obviously casual games, fun games. And it's really interesting. I think it's a really interesting fan decks. All the rules are created by me, somebody who really, I did a lot of thinking about how I could make something balanced yet fun. So, I've play tested it quite a bit. But yeah, I'd love some other people to test things out before we, put everything into print for good, just to make sure everything's okay. So I'd love feedback on that. For those of you who have purchased into the Kickstarter that I did on the Eldar Knights fan decks, we are going to have printed copies. I'm hoping by the end of March we'll have everything together. Could be a little longer, just depends, because I am in the process of hiring an editor for the fan decks that can put all the rules and all the artwork that we've created together, because we are pretty much done with all the artwork as well for all the knights and stuff like that. It is custom artwork made by an incredible artist called Argonos, and he is also on YouTube as well. So check him out. And we're going to have an update video soon on that as well. So, let me know what you guys think about that. And lastly, I do have a channel store page and an Amazon affiliate link if you want to get some discounted Eldar minis, or through the channel store page some Eldar inspired apparel. All right, guys, have a good one and peace out. See you later.